I was mid-backstroke, letting the late afternoon sun warm my face when I heard the screech. "Quentin, get out of the lake this instant." I stopped swimming and stood up, water dripping from my shoulders. The lake only reached my waist where I was. I turned toward the dock where Petra Zimmerman, head of our HOA, stood with her arms crossed and a bright yellow clipboard clutched in her talon-like hands. "It's a lake, Petra, not your private hot tub," I called back. She marched closer, heels clacking on the wooden boards like a judge entering a courtroom. "The HOA rules clearly state that recreational swimming is not allowed in community water features." "Community water features," I laughed. "It's a natural lake." I checked the county records before I even bought the house. Petra's lips curled into that sour lemon expression she always made when someone challenged her authority. Regardless, the HOA board voted and deemed the lake off-limits for swimming. It's a safety concern. "You'll receive a fine." "How much?" I asked, already knowing I wasn't going to pay a dime. $1,000, she said, like it was a completely reasonable penalty for taking a dip in a body of water that had been there long before this HOA even existed. "You're out of your mind," I said, wading out of the water. "And you know that lake isn't even part of the HOA land." Petra's eyes narrowed. "We'll see what the county says when we report this." I dried off, went straight home, and pulled up the plat maps. County GIS confirmed it. The lake sat just outside the HOA designated boundary lines. The odd part, it had no listed private owner. By the next morning, I was at the county recorder's office. After a few curious brows were raised and a surprisingly small fee was paid, I walked out as the new legal owner of Lake Merriwood. Petra had no idea what was coming. The notice came 3 days later, bold red ink stamped across the top like a badge of honor. "Final warning, unauthorized use of HOA property." It was tucked into my mailbox without an envelope, folded once and damp at the corners. I unfolded it slowly, not because I was surprised, but because I already knew where this was headed. The letter accused me of endangering the community and blatantly disregarding community safety protocols. It demanded immediate payment of the $1,000 fine and threatened suspension of my voting privileges at the next HOA meeting. Cute. I walked the half-block to Petra's house, the letter in hand. Her garden was immaculate, every hedge squared off and flowerbed symmetrical. I rang the bell. Petra opened the door halfway, like I was selling magazines. "You're trespassing," she said, not even glancing at the paper in my hand. "You sent this without a return address. I figured I'd hand-deliver my response. I don't accept house calls." "You can submit all correspondence through the HOA's online portal." "I'm not a member of the HOA anymore," I said calmly. "You lost jurisdiction the moment I became the legal owner of the lake." She snorted. "Ownership doesn't exempt you from community regulations. Actually, that's exactly what it does when the property lies outside your governing boundaries." "You're mistaken," she said, but her voice wavered slightly. "I'm not. And just so you know, the dock you've been using to take your little sunrise walks, it extends 12 feet onto my land. That's trespassing. That dock was built by the HOA 5 years ago, and 5 years ago the lake was unclaimed public land," I said, pulling a second document from my folder. "Here's the property line from the county, everything east of this marker. Mine." She stared at the paper but didn't reach for it. "I'm charging $10,000 for unauthorized use. Invoices go out Monday." "You wouldn't dare," she hissed. "I wouldn't have to if you'd stop pretending you run the county." I turned and walked back down the path, her wind chimes rattling behind me like a warning bell, but I wasn't worried. I had receipts. Literally. The next morning, I installed 2 motion-activated trail cameras along the eastern bank. One pointed at the dock, the other toward the gravel path that HOA board members had been using as a shortcut during their evening walks. I didn't need petty revenge, I needed documented violations. By the end of the week, I had 6 separate videos. Petra with her dog, letting it off leash to sniff along the waterline. Greg, the treasurer, fishing with a cooler and a 6-pack. And Rachel, the secretary, clipping chrysanthemums and placing them in a tote bag. The HOA had made plenty of noise about preserving native flora. Apparently, That didn't apply when it matched Rachel's color scheme. I sent out the invoices Saturday morning. Each board member received a certified letter with time-stamped screenshots and a formal bill for trespassing. $10,000 payable within 30 days, no exceptions, no warnings. By Tuesday, they called an emergency meeting. It was held in the community clubhouse. I arrived early, sat dead center in the front row, and watched the board shuffle in with tight jaws and paler-than-usual complexions. Petra scanned the room, spotted me, and stiffened. "We're here to discuss the recent legal claims filed by Mr. Quentin Moore," she announced, gripping the podium like it might buck her off. "We believe these claims are retaliatory, baseless, and harmful to community morale." I raised my hand. "This isn't school," she snapped. "Then why are you lecturing instead of addressing the legal issue?" A few neighbors chuckled. Others leaned forward, finally invested in a meeting that wasn't about mailbox paint or Christmas light duration. Greg cleared his throat. "We understand you've purchased the lake, but we believe the dock falls under an easement granted to the HOA by the prior landholder." "That easement expired when the land transferred ownership," I replied. "It wasn't permanent and nothing was renewed. I checked with the county clerk." "Twice," Rachel leaned into her mic, "but the community has always used the lake. It's part of our identity." "Tradition doesn't override property laws," I replied. "I didn't complain when you fined me for swimming, but I also didn't threaten you. I took legal steps." "You're welcome to do the same." Petra banged her gavel, which wasn't even necessary for HOA meetings and had clearly been purchased for drama. "This isn't a courtroom, Quentin." "No, but it might become one," I said. "If you're worried about morale, you should have thought about that before handing out arbitrary fines and misrepresenting your jurisdiction." Murmurs rippled through the room. A few residents whispered to each other. One man near the back stood up. "I live on the north cul-de-sac," he said. "And I've been fined twice for parking my truck in my own driveway." I checked. "The bylaws don't mention commercial vehicles." "They do now," Rachel said quickly. "You can't change the bylaws retroactively," he shot back. That opened the floodgates. 10 more residents stood and started listing fines they felt were unfair, misapplied, or completely made up. Lawn length measurements, holiday decorations, garden gnome placements. One woman was fined $200 for having a bird feeder too close to the sidewalk. The board quickly lost control of the meeting. Petra tried to adjourn, but no one moved. Some demanded transparency. Others wanted a formal audit of the HOA's finances. One woman, a retired paralegal, offered to file for an injunction against any further fines until the board could prove they were operating within legal bounds. I didn't need to say another word. The board was drowning in its own arrogance. 2 days later, I received a letter from a law firm representing the HOA. It tried to argue that my invoices were malicious and unenforceable. I replied with a certified letter of my own, attaching the relevant sections of state trespassing statutes and the footage. I also added a note. "I'm willing to waive the fees if the HOA formally rescinds the fine issued to me and acknowledges the lake is private property, not subject to HOA regulation." No response, until the county sheriff showed up. He came on a Thursday afternoon, cruiser pulling up slowly to my driveway. I stepped out to meet him, already expecting some kind of bluff. "Afternoon, Mr. Moore," he said, tipping his hat. "Got a report of unlawful fencing on public land." I raised my brow. "I haven't built any fences," he scratched his chin. "That's what I figured, but your name came up in an anonymous complaint. Let me guess, Petra Zimmerman." The sheriff didn't confirm, but the look said everything. I walked him to the lake's edge, showed him the property line survey, the deed, and the time-stamped footage of the board members using the land after ownership transferred. He whistled low. "You did your homework." "I had to. They're trying to bully the whole neighborhood." He nodded slowly. "You want to press charges?" "Not yet. But I want it on record that I've documented multiple trespasses. If they escalate, I'll escalate." He tipped his hat again. "Fair enough." The HOA withdrew the fine a week later. No apology, no acknowledgement, just a bland notice in the community newsletter. The board has decided to discontinue enforcement actions related to the lake, but the damage was already done. At the next election, Petra and her entire slate were voted out, replaced by a group of residents who actually wanted to manage, not dominate. The new president, the man from the cul-de-sac with the pickup truck. His first order of business, a motion to refund every improperly issued fine from the last 3 years. It passed, unanimously. As for the lake, I posted a small wooden sign near the dock. Private property. Swimming encouraged. HOA interference prohibited by law. Every summer since, the neighborhood kids have come by with inflatable tubes and water shoes. I even put up a rope swing. The new board asked if they could host a community picnic by the lake this year. I said yes. They asked what the fee was. Just don't bring Petra. 2 months after the lake fiasco, a quiet calm returned to the neighborhood. The new HOA board members were still settling into their roles. The community newsletter now included things like local wildlife spotting and upcoming potluck themes, instead of veiled threats about mailbox paint or political yard signs. I didn't have to dodge passive-aggressive stares on evening walks anymore, but the calm didn't last. It began with a letter, again unsigned, but this time sent to the county zoning office. A request to reclassify Lake Merriwood as a community hazard zone due to improper shoreline maintenance. It accused the property owner me of contributing to erosion and flooding risks, and went so far as to attach photos of a completely different lake from another part of the state. I only found out because a county inspector showed up unannounced on a Wednesday afternoon. He wore a wide-brimmed hat and carried a clipboard that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 80s. "I'm here to evaluate a potential code violation," he said, adjusting his glasses and flipping through a stack of printed pages. "Based on what exactly?" I asked. He hesitated. "We received a complaint about unpermitted shoreline alteration and possible contamination." I led him around the lake, pointing out the unchanged shoreline, the healthy cattails, the absence of any erosion or runoff. His frown deepened with each step. "This isn't matching what I was sent," he said, holding up a photograph of a polluted swamp with algae blooms and rusted metal barrels half submerged. It looked like a Superfund site. "That's not even the same region," I said. "That's definitely not Merriwood." He sighed, made a few notes, and tucked the photo away. "I'll be filing this as an unfounded complaint, but I'll note the attempt to mislead." Before he left, I asked for a copy of the complaint under the Freedom of Information Act. 3 weeks later, it arrived. The sender was listed as concerned resident, but the attached metadata on the digital form had a traceable IP address. I forwarded the info to a friend of mine. Carla works in the IT department at the county courthouse. She traced the IP back to an address right here in Merriwood, Petra Zimmerman's house. I didn't respond right away. I waited, because I'd noticed something else in the complaint packet. The form had been submitted under a staff account belonging to a former county employee, someone who'd retired 6 years ago. That meant Petra hadn't just lied, she'd impersonated a government official. I scheduled a meeting with the county prosecutor's office. I brought the complaint, the metadata, the photos, and Carla's trace log. The assistant DA I met with, a sharp-eyed woman named Meredith, asked one question after looking through the evidence. "Has she done this before?" "Depends on what you mean. She's misused her authority plenty. But this is the first time I've caught her impersonating a public employee." Meredith leaned back in her chair. "That's a felony. If we can prove she submitted this under someone else's credentials, she's looking at criminal impersonation, submitting false documents, and possibly attempted fraud if we can show she did it to cause financial harm." I gave a statement. 2 weeks later, Petra was arrested. It made the local paper. Nothing front-page dramatic, but enough to cause a stir. The article mentioned her previous role on the HOA, her history of aggressive enforcement, and the fact that she was under investigation for using false government documents to forcibly reclassify private property. The fallout was immediate. The remaining members of the old board resigned from their secondary HOA committees. Petra had appointed them to things like the Landscape Aesthetics Task Force and the Community Unity Patrol. Their resignations weren't so much letters as one-line emails. Effective immediately. I'm stepping down. Please remove me from all further communications. The new board, meanwhile, reached out to me with a surprising request. Would you consider joining us? Asked Henry, the pickup truck owner now serving as president. We need someone who understands the legal side of things. I'm not exactly a diplomat, I said, glancing over at the stack of trail cam footage still sitting in my office. That's why we're asking. I didn't join the board, but I did agree to serve as a community liaison for property disputes. It was an unofficial role, mostly involving residents asking if they could paint their fences or plant fruit trees without triggering some obscure violation. I liked it. It kept things honest, but Petra wasn't done. Her arrest hadn't come with jail time, just a court date, and a temporary restraining order against filing complaints with any government office. But 2 weeks before her hearing, something strange happened. A surveyor showed up at my lake. Not from the county, this one worked for a private firm. He had a drone, a laser scanner, and a company truck with the logo scrubbed off. When I asked who hired him, he just said, "Private client, real estate development interest." I called my attorney. Turns out, Petra had transferred the deed to her home into a shell company registered in Delaware, then used that company to hire a developer to propose a community revitalization project that would involve building a boardwalk along the lake's edge on my property. It was absurd. Legally impossible, but that didn't stop them from submitting a proposal to the city's development office anyway. I went straight to the zoning board's next public hearing. When my name was called, I stood before the panel and passed out copies of my deed, the county maps, and a notarized declaration from the previous landholder confirming the lake had never been zoned for commercial development. Then I dropped the final piece, a letter from the state's environmental agency confirming that Lake Merriwood was classified as a protected wetland buffer zone. Any attempt to develop within 50 feet of the shoreline would require not only permits, but also a full environmental impact study. The board didn't even deliberate. They dismissed the proposal on the spot, but that wasn't the end. I had discovered something else buried in the fine print of the development paperwork, a purchase option agreement. It showed that Petra's shell company had offered to buy 3 adjacent properties if the boardwalk plan went through. All 3 were currently owned by elderly residents who had no idea their homes were being targeted. I visited each one, explained what was happening. 2 of them were furious. The third, Mrs. Calhoun, nearly cried when I told her that the helpful lady who offered to take over paperwork for her was trying to flip her property for profit. The city opened a fraud inquiry. Petra's shell company was subpoenaed. The paper ran a second article. Former HOA president faces new allegations of property scheme. At her court hearing, the judge denied bail. Too many overlapping investigations, too many fake names and front businesses. She was remanded for trial. After that, things finally settled. The lake stayed quiet, except for the occasional splash from a kid cannonballing off the rope swing. The HOA newsletter now had a woodworking corner and a recipe swap section. The new board hosted quarterly Q and a sessions in the clubhouse, open to all residents, no fines, just conversation. One evening, I got a knock on my door. It was Mrs. Calhoun holding a pie tin. "Apple crumble," she said. "I never got a chance to thank you. You don't have to, I know, that's why I'm doing it." We sat on the porch, watching the dragonflies skim across the lake. For the first time since I moved in, I felt like the place was truly mine, not just the deeded part, but the whole community. The HOA hadn't just lost its grip. It had been replaced by something better. It didn't happen because of a lawsuit or a fine. It happened because people finally saw what unchecked power looked like and they chose to stand up. One swim, $1,000, one lake, and one person saying no sometimes, that's all it takes. The wind had shifted. You could feel it in the way people paused to talk on sidewalks now, how neighbors waved longer than they used to, how the clubhouse bulletin board started filling with things that weren't just warnings or sanitized agendas. Still, I had a few loose ends to tie up. One of them showed up at my doorstep on a rainy Tuesday morning. "I'm looking for Quentin Moore," the man said, rain dripping from his hood onto his clipboard. You found him, I said, eyeing the county seal on his badge. What's this about? He introduced himself as Investigator Dillard from the state's Financial and Property Fraud Division. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. We've opened a case involving multiple fraudulent transfers tied to Petra Zimmerman's Shell Corporation. Your name appears in several of the supporting documents primarily as the property owner whose land was used as leverage without consent. I stepped aside and let him in. He spread out copies of forged contracts and option agreements on my dining table. One of them showed a backdated lease agreement, supposedly signed by me, granting Petra's now defunct company access to the lakefront for seasonal community events. It was laughably out of character someone had even tried to fake my signature, but they got the slant of the Q entirely wrong. Did she actually use this document to justify construction plans? I asked, flipping through the pages. Worse, Dillard said. She used it to secure a private investor loan, over $200,000. That explained the sudden push for development, the drone scans. The real estate proposals filed under a Delaware address. Petra hadn't been angling for community improvement, she'd been borrowing against land she didn't own, gambling on approvals that never came. She's facing charges for wire fraud, falsifying legal documents, and obtaining funds through deception, Dillard continued. What we need from you is an affidavit confirming that you never signed or authorized this lease. I'll have it by tomorrow, I said. And I want to testify when this goes to trial, he nodded. I'll put your name on the witness list. After he left, I called Henry. I told him what was happening and that it was going to get public again. He didn't sound surprised. The board's behind you, he said. Whatever you need. 2 weeks later, Petra's trial date was set. Her attorney tried to push for a plea deal, but the prosecutor refused. The financial records were too damning. The fake signatures, the misused permits, the forged emails between Petra and the supposed investor liaison that turned out to be a second alias, every piece stacked higher than the last. The courtroom filled quickly on the first day. A few reporters sat at the back, scribbling notes. The judge, a woman with a voice like gravel and zero patience, wasted no time. When I took the stand, I was asked to identify the fraudulent lease. This is the document that claims I signed away lake access, I said, holding it up. But I didn't. I've never seen this until the investigators showed it to me, and the signature whoever forged it didn't even get my last name right. It's missing the second O. The jury laughed. The judge didn't. Later that day, Mrs. Calhoun took the stand. Her voice was trembling, but her words were clear. She told me I had to sign because of new zoning rules. Said if I didn't, the HOA would start charging me for water runoff from my gutter. I didn't know she wasn't allowed to do that. The prosecutor leaned in. Did she ever mention a developer? No. I found that out when I got a letter from a company in another state offering to buy my property at a reduced rate due to limited future access. By the end of the week, Petra was convicted on all counts. The judge ordered restitution to the investors, a 5-year prison sentence, and a permanent ban from holding any position of authority in any housing association in the state. She was led out in cuffs, her eyes darting around the courtroom like she was still looking for an angle. But there weren't any left. After the trial, the new board held a special meeting, this time hosted on the lake's edge, under a canvas tent with folding chairs and coolers full of lemonade. The turnout was the biggest we'd ever had. Henry stood up in front of everyone. We've made mistakes, he said. But what matters is how we move forward. Starting today, no more secret committees, no more fines without full transparency. And no more board members who think they're above the law. Someone in the back called out, "How about we make Quentin honorary mayor of the lake?" Everyone laughed, but someone brought over a carved wooden sign later that week anyway. Burned into it were the words "Lake Merriwood protected by the people." I hung it on the dock. Over the next few months, things truly changed. The board rewrote the bylaws with community input. They removed vague language, added protections against unilateral decision-making, and introduced a rule that any fine over $50 had to be approved by a majority of residents present at a public meeting. We even voted to create a community archive keeping records of every decision, complaint, and budget. I volunteered to help scan and organize the old documents. That's when I found something unexpected. An envelope at the bottom of a box labeled Historical Correspondence. Inside was an old letter, yellowed and folded 4 times. It was from the original developer who'd built the neighborhood in the 60s. He'd written to the first HOA board, explaining that the lake had been left out of the community deed on purpose to preserve it as a shared natural space, free from regulation. It wasn't legally binding, but it was poetic justice. The man had seen what unchecked authority could become. He'd built a buffer one that, decades later, gave me the leverage I needed to stop it from spiraling. I framed the letter and hung it in the clubhouse, the lake still mine. But I let the neighborhood use it freely now. There are fishing mornings, paddleboard afternoons, and movie nights with an old projector set up on the far bank. Kids use the rope swing like it's a rite of passage. Sometimes, I just sit on the dock with a cup of coffee and watch the sun touch the water. Not long ago, Greg the old treasurer stopped by. He'd moved to a different neighborhood after resigning, but he came back for a visit. I didn't know what Petra was doing, he said. Not all of it. I should have asked more questions. I think we've all learned to ask more, I replied. He nodded, then chuckled. So how much you charging these days for unauthorized dock use? Depends, I said. You planning on fishing or just sitting? Just sitting. Then it's free. He laughed and sat down beside me. In the end, the story wasn't about the lake. It was about what happens when people stop letting fear dictate their silence. When they stop accepting that rules are rules just because someone says so. It was about watching a bully climb to the top and finding the patience and the paperwork to pull her back down. And maybe, just maybe, it was about a man who liked to swim and decided the water was worth protecting.